2 years after humanity withdrew from the Galactic Council, the war that everyone had feared finally erupted when the Krell hierarchy pushed deeper into former Council space and made the catastrophic mistake of ordering the complete extermination of the Valorian population on their occupied homeworld as a demonstration of what happened to species that resisted their rule. Admiral Jacob Price received the intelligence reports in his ready room aboard the UTS Defiance, and he read through the casualty estimates 3 times because his mind refused to accept the numbers on the first 2 passes, and when he finally believed what he was seeing, he felt something cold and final settle into his chest. Fleet Admiral Michelle Grant stood beside him, reviewing the tactical data with the calm precision of someone who had spent 40 years preparing for exactly this kind of fight, and she asked whether he was ready to give the order that would change everything, and Jacob nodded because there was no other choice left to make. He activated the fleet-wide channel and ordered every available ship to rally at the coordinates he transmitted, and within 6 hours, the largest human military force ever assembled was gathering in space with 147 warships, including 12 of the new Titan-class dreadnoughts that had been built in secret over the past 2 years. Captain Helen Barnes commanded the vanguard aboard the UTS Retribution, and she checked her weapons systems for the 5th time while her crew ran through final pre-combat checks and tried not to think too hard about the fact that they were about to start a war that might end with humanity standing alone against the entire galaxy. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace above the Valorian homeworld in perfect formation, and Helen immediately began broadcasting on all frequencies in every known language so that there could be no confusion about human intentions or the consequences of refusing to comply. She identified herself and explained that Krell forces were ordered to surrender immediately, or be destroyed, and that they had exactly 5 minutes to begin powering down their weapons and withdrawing to designated coordinates, and that failure to comply would result in the complete elimination of their fleet. The Krell commander was a veteran warrior named Thexcal, who had won 17 major engagements over his long career, and he looked at the human fleet on his displays and laughed because his forces outnumbered them 3-1, and he had never lost to an inferior force in his life. Thexcal sent back a transmission mocking the human ultimatum and suggesting that they retreat immediately if they wanted to avoid joining the Valorians in extinction. And Helen listened to the message without expression before checking her chronometer and noting that 4 minutes remained. She used the time to review targeting priorities and ensure that every ship in the fleet had clear firing solutions, and that overlapping fields of fire would prevent any Krell vessels from escaping once the engagement began. And she felt calm, in the way that only came from knowing that what you were about to do was absolutely necessary. Thexcal made the final mistake of his life when he ordered his fleet to open fire first, and Helen watched the incoming missiles streak toward human positions before giving the order that had been building for 2 years of watching atrocities unfold while being forbidden to intervene. The human fleet responded with weapons that had been refined and improved during 18 months of isolation, and the Krell discovered too late that humanity had not been hiding in fear, but had instead been preparing for exactly this moment with cold fury and methodical precision. Railguns that could punch through shields in a single shot tore into Krell capital ships and ripped them apart from the inside, while point defense systems that made fighter craft obsolete cleared the space around human vessels in seconds, and missiles with hunting algorithms that bordered on artificial intelligence tracked down fleeing targets with relentless determination. Helen coordinated the assault with the efficiency of someone conducting an orchestra, and she watched dispassionately as Krell ships exploded or went dark, one after another, and the enemy formation that had seemed so overwhelming moments ago dissolved into chaos and scattered debris. The battle lasted 17 minutes from first shot to final kill, and when it ended, the Krell fleet was gone, and Thexcal's flagship was a burning hulk tumbling slowly through space with atmosphere venting from a dozen hull breaches. Helen opened a channel to the Valorian surface, and her voice was gentle when she told them that their world was liberated, and that relief supplies and medical teams were on their way, and that they were now under the protection of the Terran Federation, and that no one would be allowed to harm them again. Then she broadcast to the entire sector on frequencies that she knew would be monitored by every major power in the galaxy, and her voice was hard as steel when she delivered the message that would define humanity's new role in galactic affairs. She explained that humanity had withdrawn from the Council, not because they were afraid or weak, but because they had grown tired of asking permission to do what was right, and that the Council had been given every opportunity to maintain order, and had failed catastrophically. She stated clearly that the Terran Federation would not tolerate genocide and would not abandon their allies, and would not ask for approval before intervening to protect innocent lives, and that this was not a threat or a negotiation, but simply a statement of fact about how things were going to work from now on. Lieutenant Kyle Jensen listened to Helen's broadcast from his monitoring station, and felt pride swell in his chest because this was what humanity had always been capable of, and it had taken 2 years of forced patience to remember that power. Without purpose was meaningless, but purpose without power was useless. Admiral Jacob Price stood on the bridge of the Defiance looking at the liberated world below, and thinking about all the choices that had led to this moment, and wondering whether history would judge them harshly for withdrawing when they did, or praise them for returning when they were needed most. Greg Morris watched the news feeds from the refugee center, and saw the galaxy beginning to fracture into factions as different species decided whether to condemn or support human intervention, and he knew that the next few months would determine whether this action sparked a broader war or created space for a new and better order. The Galactic Council held an emergency session to discuss the human attack on Krell forces, and the debate went on for 3 days without reaching any conclusions, because half the members wanted to sanction humanity for unauthorized military action, while the other half wanted to thank them for stopping a genocide. Councillor Vexthrin watched the proceedings with a growing sense that the Council had become irrelevant, because humanity was no longer interested in their opinions or bound by their rules, and other species were beginning to notice that the Emperor had no clothes. Captain Andrew Cole worked alongside human commanders to establish security protocols for the liberated Valorian homeworld, and he marveled at the efficiency of people who had spent 2 years planning for exactly this kind of operation, and who executed their duties with professional competence that made his own forces look amateur by comparison. He asked Helen how long humanity had been preparing for military intervention, and she smiled and said that they had been preparing since the day they withdrew, because anyone who studied human history knew that isolation never lasted, and that eventually someone would do something so terrible that staying out of it would be impossible. Back on Earth, Ambassador Lisa Morgan briefed the Terran Council on the situation, and explained that humanity now faced a choice between remaining isolated with a reputation for overwhelming force, or attempting to build a new framework for galactic cooperation that did not repeat the mistakes of the old Council. She argued that the second option was risky, but ultimately more sustainable, because humanity could not police the entire galaxy alone, and would need allies and partners who shared their values and were willing to stand together against threats to civilized behavior. The Terran Council debated for 2 weeks before reaching a consensus, and Lisa returned to space with authorization to begin quiet diplomatic outreach to species that had been victimized by the old Council system and might be interested in building something better. Admiral Jacob Price received reports that more Krell forces were massing near human borders and preparing for what looked like a major offensive, and he smiled grimly because the Krell apparently needed another lesson in what happened when you mistook human patience for weakness. He ordered the fleet to combat readiness and sent a final message to Krell leadership explaining that humanity had tried peace and been rejected, and tried isolation and watched genocide unfold, and now they were done trying anything except winning, and that the Krell could surrender with honor or be destroyed without mercy. The galaxy held its breath waiting to see whether the Krell would back down, or whether the war was about to expand into something much larger and more terrible, and humanity prepared for either outcome with calm determination born from knowing that they had finally stopped asking permission to do what was right. 18 months after humanity withdrew from galactic affairs, the fragile peace that had held Council space together finally shattered when the Krell hierarchy launched a coordinated military campaign against the smaller species of the Outer Rim, and nobody was prepared to stop them because the peacekeeping forces had been gutted by budget cuts and political infighting. Captain Andrew Cole watched the invasion unfold on his tactical display, with a sick feeling in his stomach because the Krell were hitting targets with precision that suggested they had been planning this for months and waiting for exactly the right moment when nobody would be able to mount an effective defense. The first wave hit the mining colonies in the Helios sector, and the defending forces lasted less than 4 hours before being overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower, and Andrew received fragmentary reports of civilian massacres and orbital bombardments before communications went dark, and he knew that meant everyone down there was either dead or enslaved. He wanted to mount a rescue operation, but his superiors ordered him to fall back to defensive positions around the Valorian homeworld, because that was the next logical target, and they needed to concentrate their remaining forces if they had any hope of holding the line. The Valorian government was evacuating non-essential personnel and preparing for siege warfare, and Andrew could see the fear in the eyes of his crew because they all knew that without human support, they were facing an enemy that outnumbered them 5-1 and had better ships and more experienced commanders. Lieutenant Kyle Jensen stood in the human monitoring station watching the Krell advance with growing anger, because he had friends in those colonies, and he knew exactly what the Krell did to conquered populations, and his orders to observe but not intervene felt like torture. His sensor operator called out new contacts approaching the border, and Kyle pulled up the identification data to see a massive convoy of refugee ships limping toward human space, with Krell pursuit vessels closing in behind them, and he knew that if he did not do something right now, everyone in those ships was going to die. He grabbed the communications console and opened an emergency channel to Fleet Command, while simultaneously ordering his defensive platforms to power up their weapons and targeting systems, and he started talking fast before anyone could order him to stand down. Admiral Jacob Price appeared on the screen looking like he had not slept in days, and Kyle explained the situation in 30 seconds flat and asked for authorization to provide covering fire for the refugee ships, and there was a pause that felt like an eternity before Jacob gave the order that changed everything. The Admiral said that human forces were authorized to defend any refugee vessels approaching Terran space from hostile pursuit, and that lethal force was approved if necessary to protect civilian lives, and Kyle felt relief wash over him as he passed the targeting data to the weapons crews. The human defense platforms opened fire with railguns that could punch through Krell shields like paper, and the pursuing vessels never even saw what hit them before they were reduced to expanding clouds of debris, and the refugee convoy crossed into human space under the protection of weapons that had been idle for 18 months. Kyle guided the refugees to processing stations and passed word to his superiors that the Krell were going to be very unhappy about this and that it might constitute an act of war, and Jacob sent back a message saying that the Terran Federation did not particularly care what the Krell thought about defending innocent people from genocide. Greg Morris sat in his apartment on the Council homeworld, watching the news feeds explode with reports of human military action, and he knew that this was the turning point because humanity had just crossed the line from passive observation to active intervention, and there was no going back from that. He received an urgent message from Lisa Morgan, telling him to get to the human embassy immediately, because they were evacuating all remaining personnel before the Krell decided to retaliate, and Greg grabbed his emergency pack and ran through streets that were already descending into chaos. The embassy was surrounded by desperate people from a dozen different species, all begging for sanctuary, and human security forces were trying to maintain order while processing asylum requests as fast as possible, and Greg had to show his identification 3 times before they let him through the perimeter. Lisa was in the command center coordinating the evacuation, and she looked up when Greg entered and told him there was a shuttle leaving in 20 minutes, and he needed to be on it, because intelligence suggested the Krell were planning to strike Council governmental facilities within the next few days. Greg asked what was going to happen to all the people outside who could not get on the shuttles, and Lisa said that humanity was sending additional transport capacity, but they could not save everyone, and some hard choices were going to have to be made, and Greg understood that she was already making those choices and that the weight of them was crushing her. The shuttle lifted off with 200 refugees packed into a space designed for 80, and Greg looked down at the city below and saw fires burning in several districts where riots had broken out over food distribution, and he wondered whether this place would even exist in a month. Back at the border, Lieutenant Kyle Jensen received new orders that made his hands shake when he read them, because Fleet Command was authorizing offensive operations against Krell military targets, and his small monitoring station was about to become part of a much larger deployment. He watched as human warships began arriving through the jump points in numbers that shocked him, because he had known the shipyards were working overtime, but seeing the actual results was something else entirely, and he counted 47 vessels in the first wave alone. Admiral Jacob Price was commanding from the dreadnought UTS Defiance, and Kyle listened to the fleet-wide channel as the Admiral addressed all commanders and explained that humanity had tried isolation, and it had not worked because evil would always find victims, and standing by while innocents died was not something humans could do and live with themselves. The Admiral said that the Terran Federation was going to enforce a humanitarian corridor through Krell-occupied space to allow refugees safe passage, and that any Krell forces that interfered would be destroyed without warning or mercy, and that this was not a negotiation or a political statement, but simply a fact. Kyle heard the steel in Jacob's voice and understood that something fundamental had shifted in human policy, because they were no longer asking permission or seeking approval, but simply doing what they believed was right and dealing with the consequences afterward. Captain Andrew Cole received an encrypted message from Admiral Jacob Price informing him that human forces were moving to lift the siege of the Valorian homeworld and asking whether Valorian ships would be willing to coordinate operations, and Andrew nearly cried with relief when he read it because he had thought they were going to die alone. He brought the message to his government and they authorized full cooperation with human forces, and within hours the combined fleet was moving into position while Krell commanders scrambled to figure out what was happening and why humans were suddenly everywhere at once. The Krell military leadership sent angry demands to the Terran Federation, asking what gave them the right to interfere in internal council matters, and the response they received was brief and unsigned, and simply said that might did not make right, but it did make possible, and that humanity had decided some things were worth fighting for regardless of political considerations. Greg Morris sat in the Refugee Processing Center on a human orbital station, watching new arrivals come through, and trying to help where he could, and he realized that humanity had not withdrawn from galactic civilization at all, but had simply been waiting for the right moment to return on their own terms. 1 year after humanity withdrew from the Galactic Council, the situation had deteriorated so badly that Counselor Vex Thrin found himself leading a delegation of 23 ships toward the edge of human space on what amounted to a begging mission. And he felt the weight of that humiliation in every segment of his carapace because the Krell hierarchy did not beg. And yet here he was preparing to do exactly that. The human border was marked by silent warning buoys that broadcast their message in cold mechanical voices, telling all approaching vessels to turn back immediately or face defensive action, and Vex Thrin had his communications officer hail the nearest human outpost on all standard frequencies while the rest of the delegation waited nervously behind him, wondering whether the humans would even bother to respond. The response came faster than expected, when a human destroyer dropped out of stealth so close to the flagship that collision alarms started screaming before the crew managed to shut them off, and Vex Thrin felt a spike of instinctive fear, because he had forgotten how good humans were at making their ships disappear until they wanted to be seen. Commander Helen Barnes appeared on the view screen with her expression carefully neutral and professional, and she asked the delegation to state their intentions in a tone that suggested she already knew exactly why they were here, and was not particularly impressed by it. Vex Thrin straightened himself to full height and tried to project confidence he did not really feel, when he explained that the Council wished to negotiate terms for humanity's return, and that they were prepared to offer significant concessions in recognition of past mistakes, and that the galaxy needed human participation in order to maintain stability and prosperity. Helen listened without interrupting, and when Vex Thrin finished his prepared speech there was a long silence that stretched out uncomfortably, before she finally responded that the Terran Federation had no interest in rejoining the Galactic Council, and that their decision was final, and not subject to negotiation regardless of what incentives might be offered. The counselor abandoned his diplomatic training and let desperation creep into his voice when he explained that council systems were failing and that people were suffering without human expertise and support, and that piracy was spreading across the outer rim like a disease, and that some species were beginning to question whether the council had any real authority left, and he asked her to please at least consider the humanitarian implications of continued isolation. Helen's expression softened slightly, but her words remained firm when she explained that humanity had spent 37 years contributing to galactic stability while being consistently dismissed and overruled on matters that affected human interests, and that they had grown tired of being treated as useful servants rather than equal partners, and that the current crisis was unfortunate, but ultimately was not humanity's responsibility to solve. Vexthrin wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. And that made it worse because the Council had taken humanity for granted in exactly the way she described, and now they were paying the price for that arrogance, and there was nothing he could say that would change the fundamental truth of the situation. He tried a different approach and asked whether humanity would at least be willing to establish limited trade relationships or technical exchange programs that could help address some of the most critical failures, even if full Council membership was off the table. And Helen considered the question for a moment before shaking her head and saying that any formal relationship with the Council would inevitably lead to the same patterns of dependency and exploitation that had caused the withdrawal in the first place. The commander suggested that the Council should focus on developing their own solutions and learning to manage their affairs without relying on human intervention, because that would ultimately be better for everyone involved, even if the transition period was difficult and painful. Vexthrin asked how many people would have to die during this transition period before humanity reconsidered their position, and Helen's face went cold when she replied that guilt was not going to work as a negotiating tactic, because humans had watched Council members die for decades while requesting assistance that was delayed or denied for political reasons, and that moral authority required moral consistency. The transmission ended and the human destroyer vanished back into stealth, and the delegation was left floating at the border with nothing to show for their journey, except confirmation that humanity meant what they said and was not going to be persuaded or pressured into changing their minds. Vexthrin ordered his ships to return to Council space, but he spent the journey analyzing the sensor data from their brief encounter, and what he found made his anxiety spike even higher, because the readings showed massive energy signatures deep inside human territory that could only be explained by major industrial construction, on a scale that suggested humanity was building something big. His science officer estimated that humans had at least 40 new shipyards in operation, based on the power consumption patterns, and that they were producing vessels at a rate that far exceeded their defensive needs. And when Vexthrin asked what that might mean, the science officer hesitated before suggesting that humanity might be preparing for offensive operations. Back on the Council homeworld, Greg Morris received a message from Lisa Morgan asking whether he wanted to come home because the situation in Council space was getting dangerous and the Terran Federation could not guarantee his safety if things continued to deteriorate. But Greg sent back a reply saying that he had chosen to stay, and he was going to see it through to whatever end was coming. Lisa wrote back saying she understood, but that he should know the government was watching the situation closely and making preparations for various contingencies, and that if he changed his mind, there would always be a ship waiting to bring him home, and Greg appreciated the reassurance even though he had no intention of leaving. He spent his days documenting the cascading failures in Council systems and filing reports that nobody read, because everyone was too busy trying to survive the immediate crisis to think about long-term analysis, and he watched as species that had coexisted peacefully for generations started turning on each other over scarce resources. The Krell hierarchy was making aggressive moves in the Outer Rim territories, taking advantage of the power vacuum left by human withdrawal, and several smaller species had already been forced into unfavorable treaties that amounted to vassalage in everything but name, and Greg could see the pattern forming that would eventually lead to open conflict. He tried to warn the Council, but they were paralyzed by internal divisions and unable to form a consensus on any meaningful response, and Greg realized that the same bureaucratic inertia that had frustrated humanity for decades was now going to destroy the entire system because nobody could make decisions fast enough to matter. Lieutenant Kyle Jensen watched the refugee flows increase day by day as more species abandoned their homes in Council space and sought safety in human territory, and Admiral Jacob Price kept authorizing sanctuary on a case-by-case basis, while carefully maintaining that humanity was not officially intervening in Council affairs. Kyle understood the distinction, even if it seemed like splitting hairs, because taking in refugees was a humanitarian action while taking sides in political disputes would be a policy change, and the Terran Federation was determined to maintain that boundary no matter how artificial it might appear to outside observers. But he also understood that every refugee they accepted was another person who would remember that humanity helped them when the Council could not, and that those memories would matter when the current crisis finally resolved one way or another. 6 months after humanity withdrew from galactic affairs, the cracks in Council society started showing in ways that nobody could ignore anymore, and Captain Andrew Cole found himself staring at his tactical display with a growing sense of dread. Because 3 separate pirate fleets had entered his patrol sector in the last 72 hours, and he simply did not have enough ships to respond to all of them at once. The Krevtar Reavers hit the Helios mining colonies first with brutal efficiency that spoke of careful planning and insider knowledge about which routes were no longer being patrolled by human frigates, and by the time Andrew got his ships into position, the pirates had already disabled 17 transport vessels and were stripping them of cargo, while the crews huddled in escape pods broadcasting distress signals that nobody was close enough to answer. Andrew ordered his helmsman to pursue, but the communications officer interrupted with a trembling voice to say that they needed authorization from the council before crossing into neutral space, because the regulations were very clear about jurisdiction, and Andrew wanted to scream, because people were dying right now and the authorization would take days to work through the bureaucratic channels. He submitted the request anyway, and tried to position his ships to cut off the pirate escape route, but the Reavers were too fast and too familiar with the local jump points, and they vanished into hyperspace long before the official authorization came through, and Andrew had to watch helplessly as rescue teams pulled bodies from the wreckage of ships that could have been saved if he had been allowed to act immediately. The after-action report took him 3 days to write, and it was full of cold technical language about response times and engagement protocols. But what it really said between the lines was that the old system was broken, and people were dying because of it, and someone needed to fix it fast before the death toll got much worse. On the council homeworld, Greg Morris stood in front of a committee of 12 different species trying to explain why the agricultural output across 47 colony worlds had dropped by 42% in just 6 months, and why the automated farming systems that humanity had installed were failing one by one like dominoes falling in slow motion. Counselor Jericham leaned forward with their crystalline body refracting light in patterns that indicated deep anxiety, and asked whether Greg could simply repair the failing systems himself, since he was human and should understand the technology. And Greg had to resist the urge to laugh hysterically at the assumption that any human could fix anything another human had built. He pulled up a technical schematic on the holographic display and pointed to the maintenance subroutines that required specialized knowledge of quantum agriculture algorithms and bioengineered seed matrices, and explained patiently that he was a logistics coordinator, not an agricultural engineer, and the difference between those two jobs was roughly equivalent to the difference between someone who could drive a vehicle and someone who could build one from scratch. The committee members looked at each other with growing panic, because they were finally starting to understand that humanity had not just been one species doing one job, but rather had been thousands of specialists doing thousands of different jobs across every sector of council society, and replacing all of them was going to be nearly impossible. Jericham asked whether Greg could at least translate the technical manuals so that other species could learn to maintain the systems, and Greg pulled up one of the manuals and showed them page after page of dense technical jargon full of human idioms and cultural references and mathematical notations that did not translate cleanly into any other language, because humans thought about engineering problems in fundamentally different ways than most other species did. Across the galaxy, similar problems were emerging in cascading waves of failure that nobody had predicted, because nobody had bothered to map out all the ways that humanity had become embedded in the infrastructure of galactic civilization, and now that they were gone, the whole rickety structure was starting to collapse. Medical facilities on 17 worlds ran out of synthetic antibiotics that only human pharmaceutical companies knew how to manufacture, and doctors watched helplessly as patients died from infections that should have been easily treatable, and the remaining stockpiles were rationed carefully, while researchers tried desperately to reverse engineer the production process. Defense grids protecting major population centers started showing critical errors in their targeting algorithms, because the human technicians who had installed them had used proprietary code that was locked behind encryption nobody could break, and security officers filed urgent requests for assistance that went unanswered, because humanity was no longer taking calls from council members. Trade routes that had been profitable for decades suddenly became money-losing ventures, because human shipping companies had been operating at costs that nobody else could match, and the efficiency gains they had brought to logistics networks disappeared overnight, leaving everyone else struggling to move goods at prices that consumers could actually afford to pay. Lieutenant Kyle Jensen sat in the human monitoring station at the border of Terran space, watching the long-range sensors track the chaos unfolding in Council territory, and trying not to feel satisfied about being proven right because people were suffering and dying, and that was never something to celebrate even when those same people had dismissed human warnings for years. His sensor operator called out new contacts approaching the border, and Kyle pulled up the identification data to see a ragged convoy of Valorian civilian ships broadcasting refugees codes and requesting permission to enter human space, and his standing orders were very clear about not allowing any Council-affiliated vessels to cross the line. He opened a channel to Fleet Command and explained the situation, and waited for the response that he knew was going to break his heart, because the Valorians had been good allies and decent people, and they deserved better than to be turned away. But orders were orders, and humanity had drawn a line in space and meant to keep it. Admiral Jacob Price appeared on his view screen looking older than Kyle remembered, and the Admiral studied the sensor data for a long moment, before asking whether the Valorians were being pursued, and Kyle checked the scans and confirmed that there were no hostile contacts in the immediate area, but the refugees had clearly been through combat recently based on the damage signatures on their hulls. Jacob nodded slowly and said something that Kyle did not expect, which was to grant temporary sanctuary to the Valorian ships and guide them to processing stations where they could apply for asylum in Terran space. And when Kyle asked whether that meant humanity was changing its policy about Council involvement, Jacob smiled grimly and said no, but it meant humanity still knew the difference between governments and people. The refugee ships crossed into human space, and Kyle watched them go with a complex mixture of relief and concern, because he knew this was just the beginning, and more would come. And eventually, humanity would have to decide whether to keep letting them in, or whether to seal the borders completely, and neither choice was going to be easy or clean. The Galactic Council chamber buzzed with the usual noise of 214 different species, trying to talk over each other about trade routes and border disputes, when Admiral Jacob Price walked through the main doors with Ambassador Lisa Morgan at his side, and everyone slowly went quiet, because humans rarely showed up to important sessions with both their military commander and their chief diplomat together like this, and it usually meant something big was about to happen. Jacob stood at the center podium in his pressed Navy uniform with all his medals from 3 decades of peacekeeping missions across the galaxy, and he looked tired in a way that made some of the older council members shift uncomfortably in their seats because they had seen that look before on the faces of species who were about to do something drastic and final. Lisa stepped forward and activated the holographic display that showed the official seal of the Terran Federation, and her voice was calm and professional when she spoke into the silence that had fallen over the massive chamber like a heavy blanket. The human delegation hereby withdraws from the Galactic Council effective immediately, and all human personnel will be recalled from Council space within 30 standard days, and we thank the Council for the opportunity to participate in galactic governance for the past 37 years, and we wish all member species continued prosperity and peace. Councillor Vexthrin rose from his seat, making that clicking sound with his mandibles that meant confusion in Krell body language, and his translator unit made his voice sound scratchy and uncertain when he asked what offense had been committed that would drive humanity to such an extreme measure, because surely the Council could address any grievance through proper diplomatic channels. Lisa looked at the insectoid counselor with something like sadness in her eyes, and she shook her head slowly before responding that there was no specific offense and no particular grievance that could be resolved through negotiation, because this was simply a decision that humanity had reached after careful consideration of their place in galactic society and their future direction as a species, and they had chosen to pursue a different path forward. The chamber erupted into chaos with delegates shouting questions in dozens of languages, and the translation system struggling to keep up with the overlapping voices demanding explanations and assurances and guarantees. But Jacob and Lisa simply turned and walked back toward the exit while their security detail formed up around them, and nobody tried to stop them physically because everyone remembered what happened the last time someone tried to detain a human diplomat by force. Within the first week, human merchant ships stopped arriving at council ports with their cargo holds full of manufactured goods and agricultural products and medical supplies that hundreds of worlds had come to depend on without really thinking about where it all came from or what would happen if it stopped coming. Within the second week, human military vessels began withdrawing from joint patrol sectors and peacekeeping stations across the Outer Rim territories, and suddenly pirates who had been quiet for years started testing the waters again with small, raids on isolated colonies that used to have human frigates watching over them. Within the third week, human technical advisors and engineers started packing up their equipment and saying goodbye to colleagues they had worked alongside for years, and some of them had tears in their eyes when they left, but they all left anyway because the orders from Earth were clear and absolute. By the end of the month, every human presence in council space had vanished like morning fog under a hot sun, and the border of what had been designated Zone 7 Terra went dark with automated warning buoys broadcasting a simple message in every known language that said unauthorized ships would be turned back, and that humans were no longer accepting diplomatic communications from Galactic Council members. Captain Andrew Cole of the Valorian Defense Force stood on the bridge of his patrol cruiser, staring at the empty space where the human listening post had been just 2 days ago, and his first officer stood beside him looking equally confused because the humans had been there for 12 years and had become part of the furniture of this sector, and now they were just gone. Greg Morris sat in his small apartment on the council homeworld, surrounded by boxes of his personal belongings and trying to decide whether to go home to Earth or stay and try to help these people who clearly had no idea what they had lost when humanity withdrew because he had spent 15 years working in the council bureaucracy, and he had friends here even if his own government had decided to cut ties. He pulled up the news feeds on his datapad and scrolled through hundreds of articles and opinion pieces from different species, all asking the same basic question, which was what did we do to make the humans leave, and why did nobody see this coming, and what are we going to do without them? And Greg laughed bitterly because he had seen it coming for years, but nobody had listened when he tried to warn them. The humans had built too much and fixed too many problems and made themselves too useful, and the council had started treating them like maintenance staff instead of equal partners. And every time humanity asked for support on issues that mattered, to them the council had found reasons to delay or deny or defer the decision until later, and later never came. Greg remembered the vote about expanding human colonization rights into the disputed sectors, and how it had been blocked by species who had never even visited those sectors, but did not want humans claiming territory that might theoretically, possibly, have value someday. And he remembered how Lisa Morgan had argued passionately for 3 days straight, and how she had lost the vote by a single ballot. He remembered the incident with the Krell merchant fleet that had attacked a human civilian transport in neutral space, killing 200 people, and how the council had called it a tragic misunderstanding and imposed a fine that was less than the cost of the cargo that had been stolen, and he remembered the look on Jacob Price's face when the verdict was announced. He remembered 1,000 small cuts and casual dismissals and moments where human contributions were taken for granted and human concerns were brushed aside, and he understood now that humanity had not left because of any one incident, but because they had finally gotten tired of being treated as useful tools rather than respected equals. The intercom in his apartment chimed and a Valorian voice asked if he was still planning to stay and help with the transition. And Greg looked around at his packed boxes and made a decision that surprised even himself when he said yes, because someone needed to be here to watch what happened next and to document the consequences of taking humanity for granted, and maybe just maybe to help pick up the pieces when everything inevitably fell apart.